Arlena Voss thought a solo vacation in Tunisia would heal her heart, but instead, her name would become the center of one of the most shocking love scam disappearances the country had ever seen. Arlena's instincts screamed at her to run, but the desert around her offered no safety, no cover, and no guarantee she would make it far. Idris moved with deliberate precision as he opened her door. His grip tightened around her arm, pulled her from the SUV before she could think of resistance. Her legs trembled as he led her toward one of the abandoned stone buildings that looked as if they had been forgotten for decades. But the moment she stepped inside, she understood this place had not been forgotten at all. The interior was cold and dim, with only a slit of sunlight peeking through a cracked wall. A metal chair sat bolted to the floor, its surface worn from usage. A table beside it held scattered medical supplies, laid out too neatly to be random. Syringes, gauze, small vials, and tools she didn't recognize formed a disturbing arrangement that made her heart pound harder. The sight filled her with dread stronger than anything she had ever felt. Idris tied her to the chair with practiced movements, securing her wrists and ankles using thick restraints that dug into her skin. He did it without a trace of emotion, no hesitation, no cruelty, just cold efficiency, as if performing a familiar task. Arlena's breaths grew shallow. Her mind searched desperately for explanations, but none brought comfort. This wasn't a mugging or a kidnapping for ransom. This felt organized, clinical, deliberate. Time moved differently in the silence that followed. Minutes stretched until they felt like hours. Arlena Voss thought a solo vacation in Tunisia would heal her heart, but instead, her name would become the center of one of the most shocking love scam disappearances the country had ever seen. Arlena's instincts screamed at her to run, but the desert around her offered no safety, no cover, and no guarantee she would make it far. Idris moved with deliberate precision as he opened her door. His grip tightened around her arm, pulling her from the SUV before she could think of resistance. Her legs trembled as he led her toward one of the abandoned stone buildings that looked as if they had been forgotten for decades. But the moment she stepped inside, she understood this place had not been forgotten at all. The interior was cold and dim, with only a slit of sunlight peeking through a cracked wall. A metal chair sat bolted to the floor, its surface worn from use. A table beside it held scattered medical supplies laid out too neatly to be random. Syringes, gauze, small vials, and tools she didn't recognize formed a disturbing arrangement that made her heart pound harder. The sight filled her with dread stronger than anything she had ever felt. Idris tied her to the chair with practiced movements, securing her wrists and ankles using thick restraints that dug into her skin. He did it without a trace of emotion, no hesitation, no cruelty, just cold efficiency, as if performing a familiar task. Arlena's breaths grew shallow. Her mind searched desperately for explanations, but none brought comfort. This wasn't a mugging or a kidnapping for ransom. This felt organized, clinical, deliberate. Time moved differently in the silence that followed. Minutes stretched until they felt like hours. She listened to Idris's footsteps echoing outside, and then the sound of another engine approaching. Dust drifted through the doorway as the vehicle came to a stop. Heavy footsteps approached, slow and calculated. Arlena recognized the voice before she saw the man's face. Darian Solace entered the room with a calm, confident demeanor that made her skin crawl. The man who had once sent her friendly messages now looked completely different in person, sharper, colder, stripped of any warmth. His eyes carried the unsettling focus of someone who viewed people as objects. Arlena realized she had been targeted long before she ever responded to him online. Darian examined her like merchandise, checking her vitals, inspecting her eyes, and reviewing something on a digital tablet. His attention to detail terrified her. Arlena noticed the faint marks on the floor near the chair, scratches, stains, and smudges that revealed a disturbing history. She wasn't the first person brought here. Others had sat in this same chair, restrained just as she was. Idris returned with a tray holding syringes filled with a clear liquid. The antiseptic smell in the air grew stronger. The room felt colder. Arlena tried to pull away, but the restraints held her firmly. Her breathing quickened to short, panicked gasps. She thought of her family, her friends, and the life she had worked so hard to build. None of them knew where she was. No one even knew she was in danger. The sting of the injection hit her arm before she could catch her breath. A freezing sensation spread through her veins, followed by a heavy dizziness that pulled her downward. The room wavered and darkened at the edges. Darian's figure became a shadow, his expression unreadable as he watched her consciousness slip away. Sound faded next, turning the world into a muffled blur before disappearing completely. When Arlena opened her eyes again, she was lying on a thin, dusty mattress in another part of the stone complex. Her head throbbed, her body felt heavier than ever. Her side ached intensely, and the rough bandage covering it confirmed her worst fears. Something had been taken from her while she was unconscious. Panic surged through her, but her body was too weak to respond. She forced herself to sit up, holding her side as waves of pain washed over her. The room was small and windowless, lit only by a crack in the ceiling. A metal crate sat in one corner, a rusted metal rod leaned beside it. Someone had left the door unlocked, likely assuming she was too weak to escape. Arlena reached for the rod, using it for balance as she stood. She knew she couldn't stay. She didn't know if Darian planned to move her, sell her, or silence her, but she knew none of those outcomes involved survival. She had already lost a part of herself. She refused to lose the rest. Arlena gripped the rusted rod tightly. Every movement sent a sharp ache through her side. The pain made her dizzy, but fear kept her alert. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but the distant hum of a generator told her the building was still in use. The air smelled of dust, chemicals, and something metallic. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing as she took in her surroundings. The room was small and bare, just a cracked wall on one side and a splintered door on the other. The thin mattress beneath her had stains she didn't want to examine. Her clothes were wrinkled and slightly torn, and the bandage securing her side felt tight and unfamiliar. She touched it gently and felt a jolt of panic. Her body wasn't whole anymore. A piece of her had been taken while she lay powerless. The realization was almost too much to process, yet she didn't have time to dwell on it. She forced herself to stand. Her legs shook violently and her vision blurred for a moment. The rod helped her stay upright. She tested the door. To her surprise, it creaked open easily. The corridor outside was dim and silent, lit only by a single bulb flickering at the far end. She listened for footsteps but heard nothing except her own shallow breaths. Arlena limped forward, staying close to the wall. Each step was deliberate, quiet. The corridor connected to a larger room she recognized instantly. It was the same room where she had seen the medical table, the syringes, and Darian standing over her with cold detachment. The table was empty now, but the tools were still scattered across its surface. The sight filled her with dread stronger than anything she had ever felt. She spotted a half-empty water bottle and grabbed it, drinking slowly to avoid overwhelming her weakened body. A map lay folded on a crate nearby, covered in markings she couldn't decipher. She shoved it under her arm anyway, knowing it might help her later. She scanned the room for anything else useful and noticed a set of keys carelessly left on a hook near the doorway. She took them, hoping they would open something important. As she stepped into the open air outside, the harsh sunlight momentarily blinded her. She blinked rapidly and shielded her eyes with her hand. The wind carried the dry scent of the desert, and the silence outside was unsettling. The cluster of abandoned stone buildings stretched out around her like forgotten ghosts. No voices, no footsteps, no sign of Idris or Darian. She didn't know where they were or when they would return, but she knew she needed to put as much distance between herself and this place as possible. She took a few careful steps, scanning the area for a vehicle. The SUV was gone. She cursed under her breath, though the sound barely rose to a whisper. Without transportation, her chances of surviving the desert were slim, especially with her injury. She stopped, thinking. Darian and Idris wouldn't have gone far. They might be watching her, they might be returning any minute. Her eyes drifted to a narrow path leading behind the main structure. She followed it cautiously, using the rod as a cane. The path led to an outcropping of rocks where she found tire marks pressed into the sand. They were fresh. She crouched, studying them. The tracks went in two directions, one back toward the main road and one toward deeper desert terrain. She prayed the men had taken the path toward the main road, leaving the area temporarily unguarded. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she kept moving. Each breath felt like a struggle, and sweat dripped down her face as she followed the curve of the cliffs. She clutched the map against her chest, though she hadn't opened it yet. She didn't dare stop long enough to examine it. After several minutes of slow progress, she heard a distant sound that froze her blood. The faint. Arlena forced herself to stay perfectly still behind the rock as the engine noise grew louder, vibrating through the ground. Every instinct urged her to run, but she knew movement would give her away instantly. She pressed her palm against the rough stone, trying to steady her breath. The pain in her side throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a constant reminder of how vulnerable she had become. She had no strength for a chase. She barely had strength to stand. All she could do was wait and hope the vehicle would pass without stopping. The sound eventually softened, fading toward the opposite direction. Arlena waited longer than necessary, counting slowly in her mind to calm herself. There was no guarantee Idris wasn't nearby on foot. When the silence settled again, she gathered what little courage she had and stepped out from behind the rock. She needed higher ground, somewhere she could hide or watch from a distance without staying exposed. Ahead of her, a narrow crack between two cliffs caught her attention. It was barely wide enough for a person to slip through, but it offered cover and led away from the open desert. Arlena made her way toward it, each step slow and painful. The rod became her lifeline, helping her balance as her legs threatened to give out. She squeezed into the crevice, feeling the stone scrape her arms and shoulders. The shadows inside offered relief from the sun, but the darkness also heightened her anxiety. The passage widened just enough for her to move forward without turning sideways. The deeper she went, the cooler the air became. She followed the faint slope downward until the crevice opened into a small chamber carved by time and erosion. Sunlight spilled through cracks above, illuminating the uneven ground. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than being outside. She collapsed onto a flat rock, her vision momentarily blurring from exhaustion. Her body quivered and she wrapped her arms around herself to stop the shaking. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded map she had taken from the medical room. When she spread it across her lap, she saw unfamiliar markings scattered across the desert. Some were circled, others crossed out. Lines stretched between them like a network. She realized with horror that these weren't simple locations. They were routes. Routes used by Darian's group. Routes used for transporting victims. The map was proof she wasn't the first person deceived, and she wouldn't be the last if she didn't escape. The thought made her stomach twist. She needed water, shelter, and a plan. Staying in the chamber too long would be dangerous if anyone knew about it, but moving without rest might kill her faster. She counted her breaths, forcing herself to stay focused. As she listened, she heard something faint, a soft crunch of sand outside the crevice. Then another. Someone was walking near the entrance. Her entire body tensed. She gripped the rod, though she knew she didn't have the strength to fight for long. The footsteps lingered briefly, then moved away. She exhaled shakily, relief and fear mixing in her chest. She couldn't hide here forever. The crevice might give her a momentary advantage, but once Darian's men realized she had escaped the building, they would search every possible hiding place. She needed to stay ahead of them, but she also needed something else. Distance, terrain, or any obstacle that could slow them down more than her. The chamber sloped further into darkness on the opposite side. Arlena hesitated before moving toward it, unsure where it led. But doing nothing was as dangerous as being found. She rose unsteadily and followed the slope. The narrow path grew tighter, the walls closing in as if squeezing her forward. Then, unexpectedly, the stone gave way to daylight. She emerged on the other side of the cliffs into a dry riverbed stretching far into the horizon. It offered no cover, but it also offered direction. If she followed it long enough, it might lead to a village, a road, or anyone who could help her. Her body ached with every movement, but she forced herself to continue. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. She walked until her legs nearly buckled, her breath shallow and ragged. In the distance, she spotted a solitary hut, weathered by the desert winds. It was a small chance of shelter, maybe abandoned, maybe not, but it was the only chance she had. And Arlena knew she no longer had the privilege of avoiding risks. She had to take them if she wanted to survive another hour. Arlena approached the hut with deliberate caution, moving slowly so her footsteps wouldn't echo across the empty desert. The structure looked fragile, built from sun-bleached wood and stone stacked unevenly. A torn piece of fabric flapped in the wind where a door might once have hung. She paused just outside, listening for movement inside. When she heard nothing except the distant whistle of sand brushing against the walls, she stepped through the entrance. The hut was small and cluttered, but it felt safer than the open desert outside. A few tools lay scattered on the floor, along with an old metal pot and a cracked lantern. A thin layer of sand coated everything inside, confirming the place had been abandoned for some time. In one corner, she spotted a water container half filled with warm, stale water. She drank carefully, just enough to soothe her parched throat without overwhelming her weak body. After resting for a few minutes, Arlena wandered around the hut's interior searching for anything useful. She found a tattered blanket, a piece of rope, and a dusty photograph pinned to the wall. The photo showed a young man in a military uniform standing beside the same hut she was in. His face appeared stern yet kind, as if he had once protected this land. She wondered what had happened to him, but she knew she didn't have time to piece together someone else's story. Her own life depended on moving quickly. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stepped back outside, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, making her feel small and exposed. The sky was bright, but the air carried a growing chill as the sun lowered. She needed to reach civilization before nightfall. Otherwise, the dropping temperature and her injury would become serious threats. Using the map she'd taken from the stone building, Arlena tried to match landmarks with the symbols drawn on the page. One area caught her eye, a settlement, marked with a small triangle labeled in a language she couldn't read. She hoped it represented a village. It appeared to be several kilometers from her current position, but it was the only identifiable location nearby. She gathered her strength and followed the dry riverbed leading in that direction. As she walked, she felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Her wound throbbed, and her breathing grew uneven. Still, she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that staying still would only help Darian's men close in on her. She constantly glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see a vehicle racing toward her or a silhouette climbing over the dunes. When the roofs of small clay houses finally appeared in the distance, Arlena nearly collapsed in relief. She had made it to the settlement, Rasil. The village was quiet, its narrow paths empty. She approached cautiously, unsure whether the people living here would help her or turn her away. The air smelled faintly of cooked grains and dust, suggesting life existed here despite the silence. She entered a communal building at the center of the village. Clay pots lined the walls and woven mats covered the floor. The dim interior offered relief from the heat, and she sat down, allowing herself a moment of rest. But before she could fully catch her breath, a sound cut through the quiet, the low growl of an approaching engine. Panic surged through her. As she crawled toward an opening in the wall, a black SUV rolled into the village, kicking up clouds of dust. It wasn't Darian's original vehicle, but it was unmistakably connected to his group. Arlena recognized Idris's silhouette behind the wheel, and two other men stepped out beside him. Arlena's pulse raced. She moved silently through the building and exited through a back opening. Every movement sent pain through her body, but she forced herself onward. She slipped between narrow alleyways, staying low as shadows lengthened across the ground. She spotted a small stable near the hillside and rushed toward it. Inside, the smell of straw and animals filled her lungs. She crouched behind stacked feed sacks, pressing her hand against her mouth to muffle her breaths. Footsteps echoed outside. Idris and his men spread through the village, checking every structure. One of them stood in the doorway of the stable, scanning the interior. Arlena stayed frozen, focusing on controlling the trembling in her body. After a tense moment, the man turned away and continued searching with the others. They knew their methods. They would circle back, they would search again. She needed to escape while they were still sweeping the far side of the village. The stable had a small back exit leading up a rocky slope. Arlena slipped through it and began climbing, using her hands and knees for stability. The rough terrain tore at her skin, but she kept going, needing to reach the high ground before Idris realized she had slipped past them. When she finally reached the ridge, she looked out across the vast desert. In the distance stood an old fortress perched on a cliff. Its jagged outline against the sky looked imposing, but also promising. It was the kind of place people rarely visited, the kind of place where someone like her could disappear. She didn't know if it would save her, only she knew she needed to keep moving toward it before her captors closed in again. Arlena moved along the ridge with slow, deliberate steps, her hands gripping the rocks for balance as the wind pushed against her. The fortress in the distance looked abandoned, its walls worn by time and storms. But to her, it represented the closest thing to safety she has seen since her escape. Each breath felt heavier, each movement slower. Yet the sight of that ancient structure kept her going. She needed shelter, somewhere Idris wouldn't immediately think to search. The descent from the ridge proved steep and dangerous. Loose gravel slid under her feet, forcing her to crouch low and shift her weight carefully. A few times she lost her footing and slid several meters before catching herself on jagged stones. The pain in her side flared, but she refused to stop. Stopping meant giving Idris time to find her. Stopping meant losing everything she had fought for. At the base of the slope, the terrain widened into a flat stretch of cracked earth leading toward the fortress. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in deep orange hues. Arlena walked across the barren plain as quickly as her weakened body allowed. The fortress loomed larger with each step, its walls towering and shadowed. The entrance was a narrow archway with half-collapsed stone blocks scattered around it. She hesitated only briefly before slipping inside. The interior was dim and echoing, with dust flowing in the shafts of fading light. Arlena's footsteps sounded loud against the stone floor, so she moved more quietly, choosing the shadowed edges of the hallway. Old tapestries hung in shredded layers against the walls, their colors long faded. Stairways led upward into darkness and narrow corridors branched into hidden chambers. She didn't know the layout, but she sensed that going higher might give her a vantage point to watch for approaching vehicles. She climbed a spiral staircase, leaning against the rough wall as she ascended. When she reached the top, she emerged onto a rooftop terrace missing parts of its railing. From here, she could see the village she had fled. Tiny shapes moved near the clay houses. Idris and his men were still searching. Their SUV was parked in the center of the settlement, dust rising as someone slammed a door shut. She watched as one of the men pointed toward the direction she had escaped. They were narrowing their search. Arlena's pulse quickened. She crouched behind a crumbling parapet, hoping the height would keep her hidden. The fortress might delay them, but it wouldn't stop them. Darian's organization didn't give up easily. She needed to think of her next move, though the idea of walking another kilometer felt impossible. Still, staying here too long would trap her. As she tried to steady her breathing, she spotted something unexpected near the base of the fortress. A rusted metal hatch half buried in the sand. It looked like it once led underground. A hidden exit. Her heart lifted at the possibility. If she could find where it connected inside the fortress, she might be able to escape without crossing open ground again. She descended the staircase quickly, fighting dizziness as she reached the lower floor. She explored chamber after chamber until she found a heavy wooden door partially blocked by debris. With trembling arms, she pushed away stones and splintered planks until she could slip through. Behind the door lay a long, sloping passage covered in dust and cobwebs. The air felt cool and stale, confirming it hadn't been used in years. Arlena followed the passage downward, steadying herself against the wall. The farther she walked, the tighter the space became. Her breathing echoed softly, mixing with the faint hum of wind seeping through hidden cracks. At the end of the tunnel, she saw a faint glimmer of daylight. When she reached the hatch and pushed it open, fresh air rushed in. She crawled onto the sand, trying to remain low in case Idris had drawn close. The hatch opened on the opposite side of the fortress, facing a valley she hadn't noticed before, a narrow canyon stretching between towering rock formations. It was sheltered and concealed, a perfect escape route. She stepped into the shadowed entrance of the canyon, letting the cool air wrap around her aching body. Just as she moved deeper into the passage, she heard the distant roar of an engine approaching the fortress. Idris had arrived. She glanced back once, her heart pounding, then continued forward with renewed determination. This time, she wasn't running. She was disappearing.